I'm Callie Whitmore, and I'm 28 years old. I just overheard my mother tell my aunt that I'm embarrassing and socially awkward while they arranged flowers for my sister's engagement party. They didn't know I was standing right outside the kitchen door, holding the champagne flutes they'd asked me to fetch. Apparently, watching me interact with people is like watching a car accident in slow motion. I set the glasses down quietly and walked back upstairs to my childhood bedroom, the same room I'd occupied for the past 3 months since moving back home. The same room where I'd spent countless nights wondering why I never seemed to fit anywhere, especially in my own family. The thing is, they're not entirely wrong about the awkward part. I've always been the exception in the Whitmore household. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the odd one out in your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Now, let me take you back to how I became the family disappointment. Growing up, I was the child who knocked things over at dinner parties, who stuttered through conversations with my parents' friends, who preferred reading financial journals to watching reality TV with my sister Eleanor. While Eleanor glowed at social gatherings, I seemed to absorb all the light from any room I entered. My parents never quite knew what to do with me. Dad would introduce Eleanor as our social butterfly, and me as our other daughter. Mom would sigh whenever I declined invitations to country club events, saying I was too serious for my own good. What they didn't understand was that behind all that silence and supposed awkwardness, I had developed something far more valuable than social skills. I had learned to observe, to analyze, to see patterns others missed. While Eleanor was perfecting her small talk, I was teaching myself advanced financial modeling. While she was planning sorority events, I was building a consulting business from my dorm room, but none of that mattered at family gatherings. What mattered was that Eleanor could make their friends laugh, while I made them uncomfortable with my directness. Eleanor knew exactly what to say at charity luncheons, while I asked inconvenient questions about where the money actually went. I remember the exact moment I realized I would always be the disappointment. I was 15, and we were at the Richardsons' annual Christmas party. Eleanor, just 13, was effortlessly charming a group of adults with some story about her tennis instructor. Meanwhile, I was standing alone by the dessert table, having accidentally offended Mrs. Patterson by pointing out that her exclusive investment opportunity sounded suspiciously like a pyramid scheme. Dad found me there and said, "Callie, can't you just try to be normal? For once?" Normal. As if being intelligent was a character defect I could simply choose to overcome. That night, I made a decision. If I couldn't be the daughter they wanted me to be, I would become someone they couldn't ignore. I just had no idea it would take 13 years and a completely separate identity to make that happen. The engagement party was in full swing downstairs. I could hear Eleanor's laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses and the murmur of congratulations. In about an hour, she would announce her engagement to Nathan Caldwell, heir to one of the most prominent families in the state. What my family didn't know was that 8 months earlier, I had saved Nathan's family from complete financial ruin. Chapter 2. Eleanor's engagement announcement went exactly as expected. She stood on the marble staircase in our family's foyer, radiant in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, while Nathan wrapped his arm around her waist with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "We're so excited to share our news with all of you," Eleanor beamed, her engagement ring catching the light from the crystal chandelier. Nathan proposed last weekend at his family's estate in Martha's Vineyard. The crowd erupted in applause. I watched from the back of the room, noting how perfectly choreographed everything felt. Eleanor had always been good at creating moments that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Nathan's parents, Margaret and Charles Caldwell, stood near the front, beaming with the kind of pride that comes from securing an advantageous alliance. Margaret wore pearls that had probably been passed down through generations, while Charles had the bearing of a man accustomed to having his opinions matter. "The wedding will be next Christmas," Eleanor continued, a winter wonderland theme at the Caldwell estate. More applause. More congratulations. I found myself analyzing the crowd's reaction, noting who seemed genuinely pleased versus who was simply performing the appropriate social responses. A habit that probably made me seem even more antisocial. But old patterns die hard. "Callie," Mom appeared beside me, her smile bright but her voice low. "Come say hello to the Caldwells properly. They're going to be family now." I followed her through the crowd, observing Margaret and Charles more closely as we approached. Margaret had the kind of understated elegance that spoke of generational wealth, while Charles carried himself with the authority of someone used to being the most important person in any room. What struck me most, however, was something others might have missed. Despite their polished appearance, both of them had the slightly tense posture of people carrying stress. Charles's handshake was firm, but his palm was damp. Margaret's smile was perfect, but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Mom said warmly. "I'd like you to meet our youngest daughter, Callie." "Lovely to meet you," Margaret said, extending a manicured hand. "Eleanor speaks of you often." I seriously doubted that, but managed a polite smile. "Congratulations on the engagement, you must be very pleased." "Thrilled," Charles replied, though something flickered across his expression when he said it. "Nathan's happiness is our priority." As we made small talk about wedding plans and the merits of winter ceremonies, I found myself cataloging details. The way Charles's eyes darted toward the bar more frequently than social drinking would suggest. How Margaret's hand trembled almost imperceptibly when she mentioned the estate where the reception would be held. These were the subtle tells of people under financial pressure. I should know. I'd spent the last decade learning to read them. "Well, we should let you get back to your guests," I said after a few minutes of pleasantries. As we moved away, I heard Margaret say to my mother, "Eleanor is absolutely radiant. Nathan is so lucky." "We feel the same way about Nathan," Mom replied. "The Caldwell name carries such weight in our circles." The Caldwell name. If only she knew how close that name had come to meaning nothing at all. Chapter 3. The weeks following Eleanor's engagement were a whirlwind of wedding planning and social obligations that I managed to avoid with increasing creativity. While Eleanor and Mom threw themselves into venue selections and dress fittings, I maintained my routine of morning jogs, afternoon work sessions, and evening solitude. My consulting business had grown steadily over the past few years, allowing me to work remotely and maintain a carefully cultivated anonymity. Most of my clients knew me only as C. Whitmore, a financial strategist who specialized in crisis management and restructuring. I preferred it that way: clean, professional, detached. Eleanor found me in the garden one Saturday afternoon, where I was reading quarterly reports while she practiced wedding poses for her Instagram feed. "God, Callie, could you be any more antisocial?" she said, lowering her phone. "Mom wants us to go dress shopping tomorrow, and you've already found 3 excuses not to come." "I have work to do," I replied, without looking up from my documents. "Work," she laughed, settling onto the bench beside me. "Your little consulting thing isn't exactly a real career, you know. It's more like a hobby that pays." I marked my place in the report and looked at her. Eleanor had inherited our mother's beauty and our father's charm, a combination that had opened doors for her since childhood. What she hadn't inherited was any understanding of what actual work looked like. "My little consulting thing pays more in a month than most people make in a year," I said evenly. "Sure it does." She rolled her eyes. "Look, I know you're jealous about the engagement, but you don't have to be such a hermit about it. Nathan has friends, you know. We could set you up with someone." Jealous? The assumption was so predictable it was almost amusing. "I'm not jealous, Eleanor. I'm busy." "With what? Reading those boring financial things?" She gestured at my reports with distaste. "When's the last time you went on a date? Or to a party? Or did anything that didn't involve spreadsheets?" I closed the report and studied my sister's face. Eleanor genuinely believed that everyone wanted what she had: the attention, the social status, the picture-perfect romance with a well-connected man. The possibility that someone might want something entirely different was beyond her comprehension. "I'm happy for you," I said finally. "The wedding will be beautiful. And Nathan seems like a good match." Her expression softened slightly. "He is, and his family is amazing. They have this incredible estate, and Charles is so successful. Did you know they own 3 companies? Actually, I knew they owned 5 companies, 3 of which had been on the verge of bankruptcy 6 months ago. But I just nodded politely. "Margaret has been so welcoming too," Eleanor continued. "She's already talking about me joining the hospital board and the Arts Foundation. I'll finally have the kind of platform I've always wanted. A platform built on a fortune I had saved, though Eleanor would never know that." "That sounds perfect for you," I said, meaning it. Eleanor thrived on social recognition, and meaningful causes gave her a sense of purpose beyond her own happiness. "You should really come dress shopping with us," she said, standing up and smoothing her designer jeans. "Mom thinks you're depressed or something. She's worried about you." "I'm not depressed. I'm just not particularly social." "Same difference," she shrugged. "But seriously, try to make an effort, okay? The Caldwells are important people and first impressions matter." As she walked away, I realized that Eleanor had inadvertently identified the exact problem. To our family, I would always be a first impression liability. Too serious, too direct, too uncomfortable with the performative aspects of their social world. What none of them understood was that I had already made my first impression with the Caldwells. They just didn't know it yet. Chapter 4. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in November. I was in the kitchen, making tea and reviewing contracts for a new client, when I heard voices from the dining room. Mom and Dad were entertaining the Caldwells for dinner, along with Eleanor and Nathan. I hadn't planned to eavesdrop, but Margaret Caldwell's voice carried clearly through the open doorway. "We're so excited about the Christmas wedding," she was saying. "Our family always does Christmas Eve dinner at the estate. It's become quite a tradition over the years." "That sounds wonderful," Mom replied. "We'll have to coordinate our own family gathering around it." "Actually," Dad interjected, "Daddy," and I could hear the careful diplomacy in his voice. "We were hoping to spend Christmas with both of our daughters this year. It's been challenging to find time when everyone's schedules align." There was a pause, and I found myself moving closer to the doorway. "Both daughters?" Charles asked, his tone neutral but curious. "Eleanor's younger sister, Callie," Mom explained quickly. She tends to be rather shy at social gatherings." Another pause. I could practically feel the wheels turning in Margaret's mind. "Perhaps it would be better to keep Christmas dinner intimate this first year," she said diplomatically. "Just immediate family while everyone gets acquainted." My father cleared his throat. "Of course, we understand completely. Family dynamics can be complicated." "Exactly." I could hear the relief in Mom's voice. "Callie tends to be a bit overwhelming in social situations. She asks too many questions and doesn't really understand social cues." Eleanor's laugh tinkled through the silence. "She's just really intense about everything. Last week she spent an entire dinner party explaining why someone's investment strategy was flawed. It was so embarrassing." "She means well," Dad added, though his tone suggested he was agreeing with their assessment. "She's just not particularly refined in her social interactions." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm when she responded. "I think it's wise to be cautious. The Caldwell Christmas dinner is quite formal, and we'll have several business associates attending. Given what you've described, it might be more comfortable for everyone if Callie perhaps celebrated separately this year." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just excluded, deliberately excluded because they found me embarrassing. "You're absolutely right," Mom said, and I could hear the shame in her voice. "We should have thought of that ourselves. Callie will understand." "Would I?" I set down my teacup with trembling hands. "She's always been different," Eleanor added, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when positioning herself as the reasonable sister. "Even as kids, she never really fit in with our friend groups. She's just awkward, you know. Some people are naturally more introverted," Nathan offered diplomatically, though his tone suggested he was merely being polite. "It's not just introversion," Dad said, and his next words burned themselves into my memory. "Callie has always been challenging. She doesn't understand that sometimes you need to just go along with things for the sake of harmony. She analyzes everything to death and makes people uncomfortable. The important thing is that Eleanor will fit beautifully into our family," Margaret said warmly. "She has such natural grace and understanding of how to handle these social situations." I stood frozen in the kitchen, tea cooling in my abandoned cup, listening to my family systematically catalog every reason I was unsuitable for public consumption. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. "So we're agreed," Charles said, his voice carrying the finality of someone used to making decisions. "Christmas Eve dinner will be immediate family only. Eleanor, Nathan, and the parents. Clean and simple." "Perfect," Mom said, relief evident in her tone. "Callie will probably prefer spending Christmas quietly anyway. She's not really one for big celebrations." They had decided my preferences for me, based entirely on their own discomfort with who I was. As their conversation moved on to wedding venues and catering options, I quietly walked upstairs to my room and closed the door. For the first time in years, I cried, not from sadness, but from the sheer humiliation of being so thoroughly dismissed by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. What they didn't know was that in 6 months, their perfect Christmas dinner was going to take a very interesting turn. Chapter 5. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of picture-perfect snowfall that Eleanor had dreamed about for her winter wedding. I watched from my bedroom window as she and our parents drove away in Dad's Mercedes, heading to the Caldwell estate for their intimate family dinner. I had spent the morning pretending their departure didn't affect me, making breakfast for one and settling in with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The house felt cavernously empty without their chatter and last-minute preparation fuss. By evening, I was curled up on the living room sofa in my pajamas with a cup of hot chocolate, watching old movies and trying to convince myself this was exactly how I wanted to spend Christmas. Peaceful. Quiet. No obligation to perform or pretend to be someone I wasn't. My phone buzzed occasionally with photos from Eleanor, the elaborately decorated dining room, her outfit posing with Nathan beside an enormous Christmas tree, artistic shots of crystal glasses and gold-rimmed plates. She looked radiant, perfectly at home in the Caldwell world of understated luxury. I was genuinely happy for her. Eleanor belonged in that world in ways I never would, and watching her claim her place in it felt right, even if it meant accepting my own exclusion. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to treat myself to something I'd been saving for a special occasion. I went to my home office and opened the locked filing cabinet where I kept my most important documents. Buried beneath insurance papers and investment statements was a folder marked C&B Enterprises, the shell company I used for my most sensitive consulting work. Inside was a contract dated 8 months earlier, signed by Charles Caldwell on behalf of Caldwell Holdings. The consulting fee alone would have paid off my student loans twice over, but more importantly, it represented the moment I had saved one of the most prominent families in the state from complete financial ruin. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled back on the sofa with the contract, allowing myself to remember exactly how it had all unfolded. The initial contact had come through my usual channels. A referral from another client who knew someone who knew someone. Charles Caldwell needed a financial consultant who could work quickly and discreetly on what he described as a temporary liquidity challenge. When I reviewed their situation, I discovered it was far more than a temporary challenge. Caldwell Holdings was hemorrhaging money due to a series of disastrous investments and market shifts. They were facing bankruptcy within 60 days, which would have not only destroyed the family fortune but also decimated the local economy where they employed hundreds of people. The solution required more than just financial restructuring. It needed capital injection, strategic partnerships, and a complete overhaul of their investment portfolio. After 2 sleepless weeks of analysis, I presented Charles with a comprehensive recovery plan that could save the company, but only if they could secure a significant investor willing to take a substantial risk. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I offered to provide the necessary capital injection myself, becoming a silent partner in exchange for a substantial equity stake in the restructured company. Charles had been stunned when I made the proposal. My consulting fee alone suggested I was successful, but offering to invest millions in his failing company implied a level of wealth he hadn't expected from a consultant who operated out of anonymity. The truth was, I had been fortunate in ways my family never knew. My grandmother's unexpected inheritance when I turned 25, combined with several well-timed investments in early-stage technology companies during college, had given me financial freedom that even I sometimes found hard to believe. While my family assumed I was barely making ends meet with my little consulting business, I had quietly built a portfolio that afforded me independence most people could only dream of. "This is extremely generous," he had said during our final meeting. "Are you certain you want to take on this level of risk?" "I've done my homework," I replied simply. "With the right changes, Caldwell Holdings will not only recover but thrive. Consider this an investment in proven potential." The partnership agreement was structured to keep my personal life completely separate from company operations. I would remain a silent partner, with Charles maintaining full operational control, while implementing the strategic changes we had developed together. He knew my professional identity as C. Whitmore, but had no reason to connect that to the Whitmore family he would soon be joining through marriage. 9 months later, Caldwell Holdings was not only solvent but posting record profits. Charles had been able to maintain the family's social standing, continue their philanthropic activities, and provide Nathan with the kind of inheritance that made him an attractive marriage prospect. All thanks to a consultant named C. Whitmore, whose connection to his future daughter-in-law's family he had never suspected, and who he certainly would never have imagined was the embarrassing sister of Nathan's fiancé. I closed the contract file and returned it to the cabinet, thinking about the cosmic irony of my situation. The same family who considered me too socially awkward for their Christmas dinner owed their continued existence to my financial intervention. Tomorrow, I would go back to being the disappointing daughter who didn't understand social dynamics. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel satisfied, knowing I had the power to change their lives, even if they never acknowledged it. Christmas morning brought fresh snow and a text from Eleanor. "Hope you're having a nice, quiet Christmas. Dinner last night was amazing. The Caldwells are such wonderful people." I smiled as I typed my response. "Glad you had a good time. They certainly are interesting people." If only she knew exactly how interesting. Chapter 6. The months following Christmas passed in a blur of wedding preparations and carefully maintained distance. Eleanor threw herself into planning with the kind of intensity usually reserved for military campaigns, while I continued my consulting work and counted down the days until I could move out of the family home. I had found a perfect apartment downtown, a modern one-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough space for a proper home office. The lease would begin in March, giving me time to finish several major projects and build up my savings account even further. My family seemed relieved that I was moving out, though they framed it as me needing more independence, rather than acknowledging that my presence had become an ongoing source of tension for them. "It'll be good for you to get out there and meet people your own age," Mom said as she helped me pack books. Maybe you'll even find someone special once you're not buried in those financial reports all the time. I didn't bother explaining that I had no interest in getting out there, or that my financial reports were currently funding the lifestyle of her future in-laws. Some conversations weren't worth having. Eleanor was deep into final wedding preparations, transforming from my occasionally thoughtless sister into a full-blown bridezilla. Everything had to be perfect for her Christmas Eve ceremony, from the exact shade of white for her dress to the specific variety of roses for her bouquet. I want it to look like a fairy tale, she explained during one of her planning sessions at the kitchen table. Margaret says the estate looks magical in winter, especially with snow. I was only half listening as I reviewed client emails, but something in her tone caught my attention. Margaret's been very involved in the planning? I asked. Oh yes, she has such wonderful taste, and she knows all the best vendors. Eleanor's face glowed with excitement. She's already started introducing me to people on the hospital board. I'm going to have lunch with the chairman's wife next week. The transformation was remarkable. Eleanor had found her calling as a society wife, and she was thriving in ways I had never seen before. Despite everything, I felt genuinely happy for her. What I found more interesting was observing the Caldwell family dynamics from my unique position as both insider and outsider. Through my business relationship with Charles, I had learned that he was actually a thoughtful, strategic thinker who had simply been caught off guard by market changes. Margaret, from what Eleanor shared, seemed to be a woman who understood exactly how to navigate social hierarchies while maintaining genuine warmth. The irony wasn't lost on me that these were people I might actually enjoy talking to under different circumstances. Our dinner conversation months ago might have gone very differently if they had known who I really was. But that was the beauty of the separation. I could help them rebuild their empire while they continued to see me as Eleanor's awkward sister, who asked too many questions at parties. Charles knew he was working with C. Whitmore, but Whitmore was such a common surname that he'd never connected it to his son's future in-laws. Spring arrived early that year, bringing warmer weather and a sense of new beginnings. My apartment was everything I had hoped for. Quiet, organized, and entirely my own. For the first time since college, I had space to work without family interruption and the freedom to set my own schedule completely. Eleanor's wedding was still 8 months away, but the planning had reached a fever pitch. She had assembled binders full of vendor information, fabric swatches, and venue photographs that she consulted with the dedication of a graduate student writing her thesis. I think I've finally found the perfect flowers, she announced during one of my visits home. Margaret knows this amazing florist who did the governor's daughter's wedding last year. That sounds perfect, I replied, genuinely meaning it. You'll love the ceremony, she continued, her face bright with excitement. It's going to be absolutely magical. The whole estate will be decorated, and Charles is having special lighting installed in the gardens. As she described her vision for the perfect Christmas wedding, I found myself wondering what next Christmas would look like. Would I spend it alone again, or would I finally have built the kind of life I actually wanted? What I didn't realize was that next Christmas would indeed be magical, just not in the way any of us expected. The phone call that would change everything was still 6 months away, but the foundation was already being laid. The Caldwell empire I had saved was growing stronger every day, and my role in their success was about to become impossible to ignore. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people discover who you really are. The phone call that changed everything came on a crisp October morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports for 3 different clients. I had settled into my apartment routine beautifully over the past 6 months. Morning coffee while scanning financial news, client calls from 9 to noon, lunch at my desk while reviewing market analyses, and afternoons dedicated to strategic planning and research. Miss Whitmore? The voice was professional but urgent. This is Jennifer Walsh from Caldwell Holdings. Mr. Caldwell would like to schedule an emergency consultation if you're available. I set down my coffee cup, immediately focused. In the 8 months since we'd completed the company restructuring, Charles had contacted me only twice, both times for minor strategic adjustments that could have waited weeks. Emergency consultations were not his style. What's the nature of the emergency? I asked, already opening my laptop to review their latest financial reports. I'm not entirely sure of the details, Jennifer admitted, but he mentioned something about a potential acquisition opportunity that has a very tight timeline. He said to tell you it's regarding expanding our sustainable business portfolio. He thought you'd understand what that meant. I did understand. 6 months ago, I had recommended that Caldwell Holdings diversify into sustainable energy and environmentally responsible manufacturing. Charles had been interested but cautious, preferring to stabilize their current operations before expanding. If he was calling about acquisitions now, something significant had changed. I can be there Thursday morning, I told Jennifer, checking my calendar. schedule 2 hours, and ask Mr. Caldwell to prepare current financial statements for any companies they're considering. After hanging up, I leaned back in my desk chair and considered the timing. Eleanor's wedding was exactly 2 months away. The Caldwell family was presumably focused on final preparations, guest lists, and the dozens of details that went into hosting a society wedding. For Charles to be pursuing major business opportunities during this period suggested either exceptional circumstances or exceptional confidence in his company's current stability. Probably both, given that their recent quarterly reports showed profits exceeding projections by nearly 30%. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made me grateful for my reliable Honda Civic and practical raincoat. I drove to the Caldwell Holdings headquarters in downtown, a building I had never actually visited despite having saved the company that occupied its top 3 floors. The lobby was impressive: marble floors, contemporary artwork, and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money tastefully modernized. I gave my name to the receptionist, who directed me to the executive elevator with the kind of deference reserved for important visitors. Charles Caldwell's office occupied a corner of the building's top floor, with windows offering sweeping views of the city and harbor beyond. When his assistant ushered me in, I found him standing at those windows, hands clasped behind his back, looking every inch the successful businessman who had built an empire through careful strategy and calculated risks. He turned as I entered, and his face broke into the kind of genuine smile I remembered from our previous meetings. Charles had always treated me with professional respect, rather than the condescension I sometimes encountered from male clients, who assumed my gender meant I couldn't understand complex financial structures. "Miss Whitmore," he said, crossing the room to shake my hand. "Thank you for making time on such short notice. I hope I didn't disrupt any important projects." "Not at all," I replied, settling into one of the leather chairs arranged around his conference table. Jennifer mentioned an acquisition opportunity. "What kind of timeline are we working with?" Charles opened a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. 3 weeks, he said simply. "There's a manufacturing company in Pennsylvania, Henderson Industrial, that's been struggling since the owner's death 6 months ago. The family wants to sell quickly, and they're entertaining offers from several buyers." I scanned the preliminary financial statements he handed me, noting immediately why the company had caught his attention. Henderson Industrial manufactured components for renewable energy systems, exactly the kind of sustainable business we had discussed as a strategic expansion opportunity. "The numbers look promising," I said after several minutes of review. "What's driving the urgent timeline?" "Competition," Charles replied grimly. "2 of our major competitors are also submitting offers, and one of them is prepared to pay significantly above market value. They want Henderson's client contracts and manufacturing capabilities, even if it means overpaying for the acquisition." I studied the competitor analysis he provided, recognizing immediately why Charles was concerned. If either of those companies acquired Henderson Industrial, they would gain access to technology and contracts that could threaten Caldwell Holdings' position in several key markets. "This isn't just about acquiring a profitable company," I said slowly. "This is about preventing competitors from acquiring capabilities that could damage your market position." "Exactly." Charles leaned forward, his expression intense. "Henderson Industrial represents both an opportunity and a threat. If we acquire them, we strengthen our sustainable business portfolio and block our competitors from gaining strategic advantages. If we don't, we potentially face increased competition in markets we currently dominate." I spent the next hour reviewing financial projections, market analyses, and strategic assessments. The acquisition made sense from multiple angles, but the pricing would be challenging. To outbid their competitors while maintaining profitability, Caldwell Holdings would need to structure the offer creatively. "I can have a preliminary acquisition strategy ready by Monday," I told him as we concluded the meeting. "But I'll need access to more detailed financial information about Henderson Industrial, including their contracts and production capabilities." "Whatever you need," Charles assured me. "Jennifer will coordinate with their attorney to get you complete documentation." As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, Charles walked me to his office door. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to know how much I appreciate your continued partnership. The strategic changes you recommended 8 months ago have exceeded our most optimistic projections." "I'm glad to hear the implementation went smoothly," I replied diplomatically. "More than smoothly. We've had our most profitable year in company history." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I hope you'll consider expanding our consulting relationship beyond individual projects. You've demonstrated an understanding of our business that I'd like to formalize with a longer-term agreement." The offer was tempting from both financial and professional perspectives. Caldwell Holdings was exactly the kind of stable, growth-oriented company I enjoyed working with, and Charles was the rare client who actually implemented recommendations without endless second-guessing. Let's see how the Henderson acquisition proceeds, I said finally. If we can structure this deal successfully, I'd be interested in discussing a more comprehensive partnership. Driving home through the afternoon drizzle, I found myself thinking about the strange irony of my situation. In 3 hours, I had discussed a multi-million-dollar acquisition with one of the state's most prominent businessmen, who treated me as a valued strategic partner and sought my advice on major corporate decisions. Tonight, I would probably receive a text from Eleanor asking if I planned to attend her bridesmaid's luncheon, followed by a gentle suggestion that I try to be more social and less intense when meeting her future in-laws. What do you think will happen next when these two worlds finally collide? Chapter 8. The Henderson Industrial acquisition consumed the next 3 weeks of my life in the most exhilarating way possible. I threw myself into due diligence with the kind of intensity that had made me successful, working 16-hour days and surviving on coffee and takeout while building the most comprehensive acquisition strategy of my career. The challenge wasn't just structuring a competitive offer. It was creating a proposal that would appeal to the Henderson family's emotional priorities while outmaneuvering two well-funded competitors who were willing to overpay for strategic advantage. After extensive research into the family dynamics, I discovered that Henderson Industrial had been founded by Robert Henderson's grandfather in 1952. 3 generations of the family had worked in the business, and Robert's sudden death from a heart attack had left his widow and 2 adult children struggling to maintain operations they didn't fully understand. The key insight came during my second phone conversation with Rebecca Henderson, Robert's daughter, who had reluctantly taken over administrative responsibilities. She mentioned almost casually that her father had always worried about what would happen to the company's employees if the business was sold to a larger corporation. Dad used to say that big companies see workers as numbers on a spreadsheet, she told me. He made me promise to try to find a buyer who would keep the Henderson Industrial name and maintain our employee benefits program. That conversation changed my entire approach to the acquisition. Instead of focusing purely on financial terms, I restructured the proposal to emphasize Caldwell Holdings' commitment to maintaining Henderson Industrial as an independent subsidiary, preserving both the company name and existing employee benefits while providing opportunities for growth and expansion. Charles was initially skeptical when I presented this strategy during our Friday afternoon meeting. We're essentially agreeing to constraints that our competitors won't accept, he pointed out, studying the proposal I had outlined. That could put us at a disadvantage if they're offering higher purchase prices. Not if the Henderson family values legacy over maximum profit, I replied, spreading out my research on the family's decision-making priorities. Rebecca Henderson is the primary decision-maker, and she's motivated by honoring her father's wishes more than maximizing her inheritance. Our proposal positions us as the buyer who will preserve what Robert Henderson built, rather than dismantling it for parts. Charles reviewed my analysis for several minutes, then looked up with the kind of expression I had learned to recognize as his strategic thinking face. You're recommending we compete on values rather than price, he said slowly. I'm recommending we compete on understanding what the sellers actually want to achieve, I corrected. Rebecca Henderson has enough money from her father's life insurance to live comfortably regardless of the sale price. What she doesn't have is peace of mind about betraying his legacy. The strategy worked better than I had dared to hope. When we submitted our proposal the following Wednesday, Rebecca Henderson called Charles personally within 24 hours to schedule a meeting. Our competitors had submitted higher offers, but Caldwell Holdings was the only buyer who had addressed the family's concerns about preserving the company culture and employee welfare. The final negotiation took place on a Thursday afternoon at Henderson Industrial's headquarters in Pennsylvania. I accompanied Charles, ostensibly as his financial advisor, but actually functioning as the primary strategist for the entire acquisition. Rebecca Henderson turned out to be a woman in her early 40s who reminded me of myself in some ways. Intelligent, careful with words, and clearly more comfortable discussing business than engaging in small talk. Her brother Tom, who had inherited their father's engineering skills, participated in the technical discussions while deferring to Rebecca for all financial and strategic decisions. Your proposal addresses concerns that other buyers didn't even acknowledge, Rebecca said as we reviewed the final terms. Dad would have approved of the way you've structured the employee protections. Charles handled the negotiation with exactly the right combination of respect and professionalism, acknowledging Robert Henderson's legacy while outlining specific plans for expanding the company's capabilities under Caldwell Holdings ownership. I found myself genuinely impressed by his presentation. Charles had clearly spent considerable time understanding the Henderson family's priorities, and his commitment to preserving the company culture felt authentic rather than manipulative. The deal closed 2 weeks later with handshakes and signed contracts that made Henderson Industrial a wholly owned subsidiary of Caldwell Holdings, operating under its original name with expanded resources and preserved employee benefits. This acquisition positions us perfectly for the renewable energy market expansion, Charles told me as we celebrated with champagne in his office. Henderson's manufacturing capabilities combined with our distribution network should generate profits exceeding our projections within 18 months. I raised my glass, genuinely satisfied with the outcome. Here's to strategic thinking and understanding what people actually value. Here's to working with a consultant who sees opportunities other people miss, Charles replied, and his tone carried a warmth that went beyond professional appreciation. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just 3 weeks. The Henderson acquisition had been the kind of complex, high-stakes project that reminded me why I loved consulting work. More importantly, it had demonstrated that my partnership with Caldwell Holdings was evolving into something more substantial than occasional crisis management. Charles had offered me a formal retainer agreement during our celebration, along with a discrete equity stake in the Henderson acquisition. The financial terms were generous enough to secure my independence indefinitely, while the professional relationship offered opportunities to work on the kind of strategic projects I found most engaging. What made the situation particularly amusing was that Eleanor had spent the same 3 weeks obsessing over centerpiece arrangements and seating charts, completely unaware that her socially awkward sister was orchestrating the largest acquisition in her future father-in-law's business empire. In exactly 6 weeks, she would walk down the aisle at the Christmas Eve wedding she had planned so meticulously. What she didn't know was that the magical winter wonderland reception would include a surprise revelation that would change everything. Chapter 9. November dissolved into December with the kind of frantic energy that always surrounded major family events. Eleanor's wedding preparations had reached a crescendo of activity that involved color-coordinated spreadsheets, emergency flower consultations, and daily phone calls to confirm details that had already been confirmed multiple times. I maintained my strategy of helpful availability combined with strategic invisibility, offering to handle logistics that could be managed remotely, while avoiding events that required extended social interaction with the extended Whitmore and Caldwell families. "Callie, you're being ridiculous about the rehearsal dinner," Eleanor said during one of her periodic check-ins at my apartment. "It's just family and the wedding party. You're not going to embarrass anyone." I looked up from my laptop, where I was reviewing final documentation for another Caldwell Holdings project, a smaller acquisition that had emerged as a follow-up opportunity to the Henderson industrial deal. "I'm not worried about embarrassing anyone," I replied honestly. "I just don't particularly enjoy rehearsal dinners." Eleanor settled onto my couch with the dramatic sigh she had perfected for moments when people weren't cooperating with her plans. "Mom thinks you're being antisocial on purpose," she said, examining her perfect manicure. "She's convinced you're depressed about something." The irony was remarkable. I was probably the least depressed I had been in years. My consulting business was thriving, my apartment felt like home, and I had developed a professional relationship that challenged me intellectually while providing financial security I had never imagined possible. "I'm not depressed," I said, closing my laptop to give Eleanor my full attention. "I'm just busy with work." "What kind of work keeps you this busy all the time?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing her usual dismissive tone. "I mean, I know you do financial consulting, but it seems like you're always working on something urgent." For a moment, I considered telling her the truth. Eleanor was my sister, and despite our differences, she wasn't malicious. The family dynamics that had shaped our relationship were larger than either of us individually, but I had learned over the years that Eleanor processed information through the lens of her own experience. She wouldn't understand that I genuinely preferred working on complex financial problems to attending social events. She would assume I was making excuses or being difficult. "I'm working on several major projects right now," I said instead. "The timing isn't great, but the opportunities are too good to postpone." Eleanor studied my face with the kind of attention she usually reserved for wedding planning details. "You know, you've seemed different lately," she said slowly. "More confident, I guess. Like you're not constantly worried about what everyone thinks." The observation was surprisingly perceptive. I had felt different over the past year, more comfortable with who I was and less concerned with fitting into other people's expectations. "Maybe I've just found my place," I replied. "Well, whatever you found, it's working for you," Eleanor said, standing up and smoothing her designer jeans. "But seriously, please try to make an effort at the wedding. The Caldwells are important to Nathan's future, and first impressions matter." After she left, I returned to my project reviews, but her words lingered in my mind. Eleanor was right that I felt more confident lately. What she didn't understand was that my confidence came from knowing exactly what I was capable of accomplishing, rather than constantly wondering whether I measured up to other people's standards. The Henderson industrial acquisition had been a turning point in more ways than I had initially realized. Working directly with Charles on high-stakes negotiations had demonstrated that my skills extended far beyond crisis management and financial restructuring. I could develop comprehensive strategies, manage complex stakeholder relationships, and execute deals that created value for everyone involved. More importantly, Charles treated me as a genuine partner rather than a hired consultant. Our working relationship had evolved into something approaching mutual respect and shared vision for strategic growth. The formal retainer agreement we had signed the previous week reflected this evolution. Instead of project-based consulting, I now functioned as Caldwell Holdings' strategic advisor with equity participation in major deals. The financial arrangement was generous enough that I could afford to be selective about additional clients, focusing on projects that interested me, rather than accepting every opportunity for income security. Thursday afternoon brought a phone call that reminded me how much had changed in my professional life. "Callie, it's Charles. Do you have time for a quick conversation about the Morrison Industries opportunity?" Morrison Industries was a renewable energy company based in North Carolina that had approached Caldwell Holdings about a potential merger. The preliminary discussion suggested a deal structure that could double our sustainable energy portfolio while providing Morrison with the capital resources they needed for expansion. "I reviewed their financial statements this morning," I told him. "The opportunity looks promising, but their debt structure is more complex than Henderson Industrial was. We'll need to be creative about the merger terms." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Charles replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Morrison's CEO is flying up here next week for preliminary negotiations. I'd like you to lead the financial discussions." Leading negotiations rather than providing background analysis represented another evolution in our working relationship. Charles was trusting me with increasingly visible responsibilities, which suggested he valued my judgment beyond technical expertise. "I'll prepare a comprehensive analysis and proposed merger structure by Tuesday," I assured him. "Perfect. And Callie, I want you to know how much I appreciate having a strategic partner I can trust completely. It makes a tremendous difference in how aggressively we can pursue these opportunities." After we hung up, I sat at my desk considering the path that had brought me to this point. 18 months ago, I had been the family disappointment who couldn't manage normal social interactions. Today, I was a strategic partner in one of the state's most successful companies, leading negotiations that would shape our expansion into emerging markets. What made the situation particularly satisfying was that my success had nothing to do with changing who I was to fit other people's expectations. I had succeeded by leveraging my natural analytical abilities and strategic thinking skills, working in environments that valued results over social performance. In 2 weeks, Eleanor would marry into the family whose business empire I had helped save and build. The wedding would be everything she had dreamed of: elegant, perfectly coordinated, and attended by the kind of people who mattered in their social world. And somewhere during that magical Christmas Eve celebration, they were going to discover exactly who I really was. Chapter 10. The week before Eleanor's wedding passed in a blur of final preparations, family arrivals, and carefully orchestrated events designed to showcase the perfect union of two prominent families. I maintained my usual strategy of helpful efficiency, combined with social minimalism, handling logistics and remaining largely invisible during gatherings that required extended interaction with guests. Monday brought Eleanor's bridesmaids' luncheon, which I attended despite my general aversion to events centered around wedding-related bonding. The restaurant was one of those places that specialized in elaborate salads and champagne cocktails, decorated for the occasion with white roses and gold ribbon that matched Eleanor's wedding color scheme. I found myself seated between Nathan's sister Amanda and Eleanor's college roommate Sarah, both of whom seemed genuinely pleasant but occupied entirely different social universes than I did. Amanda worked in fashion marketing and spoke enthusiastically about upcoming runway shows, while Sarah had recently returned from a European vacation that provided endless material for Instagram-worthy anecdotes. "Callie, Eleanor tells me you work in finance," Amanda said during the appetizer course. "That must be fascinating." The polite interest in her voice suggested she was making conversation rather than expressing genuine curiosity, but I appreciated the effort. "It can be," I replied diplomatically. "I work primarily with strategic consulting and corporate restructuring." "Like helping companies when they're in trouble?" Sarah asked, pausing in her description of a cathedral in Barcelona. "Sometimes. More often it's about identifying opportunities for growth and expansion." The conversation moved on to safer topics like wedding planning and holiday traditions, allowing me to retreat into my preferred role of interested observer. I watched Eleanor hold court at the head of the table, radiant with happiness and completely in her element as the center of attention. What struck me most was how naturally she assumed that everyone shared her enthusiasm for wedding details and romantic traditions. Eleanor genuinely couldn't understand why someone might prefer discussing market analysis to flower arrangements, but she wasn't deliberately dismissive about it. She simply operated from the assumption that her priorities were universal. Tuesday evening brought the formal rehearsal dinner at the country club, an event I couldn't avoid despite my general preference for smaller gatherings. The club's private dining room had been decorated to complement the wedding's winter wonderland theme, with silver and white linens, crystal candlesticks, and centerpieces that managed to look both elegant and festive. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a navy dress that Mom had deemed appropriate but not attention-grabbing, and found my assigned seat at a table with various extended family members and family friends. The seating arrangement had clearly been designed to separate me from the head table where Eleanor, Nathan, and both sets of parents would hold court. Charles and Margaret Caldwell looked exactly as I remembered them from Eleanor's engagement party, polished, confident, and completely at ease in social situations that required gracious conversation with relative strangers. Charles wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, while Margaret had chosen a sophisticated burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair beautifully. What I found most interesting was observing them interact with my parents. Dad clearly admired Charles's business acumen and asked knowledgeable questions about market conditions and industry trends. Mom seemed genuinely charmed by Margaret's combination of warmth and sophistication, eagerly discussing their shared involvement in various charitable organizations. The evening progressed exactly as these events always did. Multiple toasts, carefully coordinated speeches, and the kind of comfortable socializing that came naturally to everyone except me. I managed appropriate responses to dinner conversation while mentally reviewing the Morrison Industries merger analysis I would be presenting the following week. Callie seems to be doing well, I heard Margaret comment to my mother during a brief lull in conversation. Eleanor mentioned she's moved into her own place. Yes, she's found a lovely apartment downtown, Mom replied, and I could hear the subtle relief in her voice. It's been good for her to have more independence. The subtext was clear. My moving out had been good for everyone, reducing the daily reminder of my failure to fit seamlessly into family social dynamics. Nathan's father gave a brief speech welcoming Eleanor to their family, emphasizing the values and traditions that would now be shared between the Whitmores and Caldwells. He spoke eloquently about the importance of partnership, mutual respect, and building something together that was stronger than what either family could achieve alone. To Eleanor and Nathan, Charles concluded, raising his champagne glass, may your marriage be the foundation for a lifetime of shared adventures and mutual success. Everyone raised their glasses and drank to the couple's future happiness. I found myself genuinely moved by the warmth and sincerity of the toast, even as I wondered what Charles would think if he knew that his daughter-in-law's sister was already playing a significant role in his family's business adventures. Wednesday passed quietly with final preparations and a family dinner that felt relaxed compared to the formal events of previous days. Eleanor seemed calmer now that the major parties were complete, though she maintained her detailed preparation lists and continued checking on various arrangements with the intensity of someone managing a corporate merger. Everything's going to be perfect, she said as we sat in the kitchen after dinner, reviewing her timeline for the following day. The weather forecast is ideal. The flowers are exactly what I wanted, and Margaret says the estate has never looked more beautiful. It sounds like it will be exactly the wedding you've always dreamed of, I said, meaning it sincerely. Eleanor looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. I'm glad you'll be there, she said quietly. I know family events aren't really your thing, but it means a lot to me that you're making the effort. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt about the secret I had been keeping. Eleanor deserved to know that her socially awkward sister was actually a successful business partner with her future in-laws. But tomorrow wasn't the right time for revelations that might overshadow her perfect day. I wouldn't miss it, I assured her. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange irony of my situation. Tomorrow I would attend Eleanor's wedding as the family member who didn't quite fit, watching her marry into a family whose business success I had helped engineer from the shadows. In less than 24 hours, that carefully maintained separation between my two worlds was about to end in the most unexpected way possible. Chapter 11. Christmas Eve dawned with exactly the kind of picture-perfect snowfall that Eleanor had dreamed about for her winter wedding. I woke early in my apartment, allowing extra time for the drive to the Caldwell estate and the lengthy preparation process that formal family events always required. My dress hung ready in my closet, a midnight blue silk that Mom had helped me select during one of our rare successful shopping expeditions. The color was sophisticated enough for an evening wedding while remaining sufficiently understated to avoid drawing attention away from the bride. By noon, I was dressed and driving through light snow toward the Caldwell estate, located on several hundred acres of pristine countryside about 30 minutes outside the city. I had seen photographs of the property in various society publications, but experiencing it in person was genuinely impressive. The main house was a classic Georgian colonial that had been beautifully maintained and tastefully modernized over the decades. Today it was decorated for Christmas with understated elegance. Evergreen swags on the columns, white lights outlining the roofline, and massive wreaths flanking the front entrance. The effect was magical without being ostentatious. Wedding guests were beginning to arrive as I pulled into the designated parking area, guided by uniformed attendants who managed traffic flow with military precision. I recognized several faces from various society events I had attended with my family over the years, along with many people I didn't know who presumably represented Nathan's extended family and the Caldwell's social circle. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the estate's conservatory, which had been transformed into a winter wonderland with white flowers, silver ribbon, and enough candles to create a genuinely romantic atmosphere. I found my assigned seat several rows back from the altar, positioned with other extended family members and family friends. Eleanor looked absolutely radiant when she walked down the aisle on Dad's arm. Her dress was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Classic lines, delicate beading, and a cathedral train that managed to look both timeless and thoroughly modern. Nathan's face when he saw her approaching was exactly what every bride hopes to see, complete adoration mixed with overwhelming joy. The ceremony itself was beautiful and mercifully brief, with traditional vows and readings that felt sincere rather than performative. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the genuine happiness radiating from both families was infectious enough to make even cynical observers feel touched by the moment. Cocktails followed in the main house's grand salon, where guests mingled while the bride and groom posed for photographs in various locations around the estate. I stationed myself near one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens, content to observe the social dynamics while avoiding extended conversations with relatives I saw only at major family events. The reception began at 7 in a magnificently decorated ballroom that had been designed specifically for entertaining. Round tables dressed in white linens and silver chargers surrounded a dance floor, while the walls were lined with evergreen trees strung with thousands of white lights. The effect was simultaneously festive and sophisticated. I found my table assignment, predictably positioned at an appropriate distance from the head table where Eleanor and Nathan would sit with their parents and wedding party members. My dinner companions included several of Nathan's business associates and their wives, along with a few family friends who seemed pleasant enough for the evening's requirements. Charles Caldwell stood to offer a toast as dinner was being served, and his words captured exactly the kind of warmth and sincerity that had impressed me during our business meetings. "Eleanor," he said, raising his champagne glass, "you have brought joy and laughter to our family from the moment Nathan first mentioned your name. Tonight, we officially welcome you as our daughter, and we couldn't be more delighted to have you join the Caldwell family." The applause was genuine and sustained. Eleanor looked absolutely luminous as she accepted Margaret's embrace and Charles's kiss on her cheek. "And to Nathan," Charles continued, "your mother and I are proud of the man you've become and excited to see the future you and Eleanor will build together. May your marriage be filled with the same happiness and partnership that has blessed our family for so many years." More applause. Nathan stood to acknowledge the toast and offer his own thanks to both families for their support and love. As dinner progressed through multiple courses accompanied by carefully selected wines, I found myself relaxing into the evening's rhythm. The conversation at my table was intelligently general, discussion of holiday traditions, travel plans, and current events that avoided controversial topics while remaining engaging enough to prevent awkward silences. It was during dessert service that everything changed. Margaret Caldwell had been circulating among the tables, graciously thanking guests for attending and sharing brief conversations that made everyone feel appreciated. When she reached our table, she greeted Nathan's business associates with the warmth of someone who had met them multiple times at various company events. "Mr. Anderson," she said to the man sitting across from me, "I hope you're enjoying the evening. Charles mentioned that you've been particularly helpful with the Henderson acquisition project." "It's been a pleasure to work on such a successful deal," Anderson replied. "Your strategic advisor certainly knows how to structure complex acquisitions." Margaret's smile broadened with obvious pride. "We've been extremely fortunate to find such exceptional consulting expertise. Miss Whitmore has been invaluable in developing our expansion strategy." The words hung in the air for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Margaret's eyes shifted from Anderson to me, and I watched her face change as recognition dawned. "Miss Whitmore," she repeated slowly, her voice barely audible over the ambient conversation and soft jazz music. I met her gaze steadily, offering a slight smile that acknowledged what had just happened without dramatics or explanations. "Good evening, Mrs. Caldwell," I said quietly. "Congratulations on such a beautiful wedding." Margaret stared at me for another moment, her composed social mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine confusion and dawning understanding. "Excuse me," she said faintly, turning away from our table and walking quickly toward where Charles was standing near the head table. I watched her approach her husband, speaking quietly but urgently in his ear. Charles's face went through several expressions as he processed whatever she was telling him: confusion, surprise, and then something that looked like comprehension mixed with disbelief. Both of them turned to look in my direction. Charles's eyes met mine across the crowded ballroom, and in that moment, the carefully maintained separation between my two worlds disappeared forever. The revelation I had been anticipating for months was finally happening, but not at all in the way I had imagined it would unfold. Chapter 12. The next few minutes passed in a strange suspension of time. Charles and Margaret stood together near the head table, speaking in hushed but animated tones while occasionally glancing in my direction. Other guests continued eating dessert and chatting about holiday plans, completely unaware that a revelation was unfolding that would change everything. I remained calm, finishing my champagne and responding appropriately to dinner table conversation, while internally preparing for whatever confrontation was about to occur. The anticipation I had carried for months was finally resolving, and I felt surprisingly peaceful about it. Charles excused himself from the conversation he'd been having with Dad and walked purposefully across the ballroom toward my table. Margaret followed a few steps behind, her composed social expression firmly back in place, but her eyes still reflecting the shock of discovery. "Miss Whitmore," Charles said as he approached, his voice carefully controlled. "I wonder if we might have a brief word in private." "Of course," I replied, standing and smoothing my dress. "I'll just be a moment," I told my dinner companions, who nodded politely without any indication that they sensed the undercurrents of what was happening. Charles and Margaret led me through the ballroom's side entrance into a smaller sitting room that had been decorated for Christmas, but remained empty during the reception. Margaret closed the door behind us, and for a moment all three of us simply stood in silence. "You're Eleanor's sister," Margaret said finally, her voice carrying a note of bewilderment. "I am," I confirmed simply. Charles ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested he was struggling to reconcile contradictory information. "The consultant who saved our company," he said slowly, "who structured the Henderson acquisition, who developed our entire expansion strategy, is Eleanor's sister. The sister who's too socially awkward for family Christmas dinner," I finished for him. "Yes." Margaret sank into one of the room's antique chairs, staring at me as if I were a puzzle she couldn't solve. "But you're brilliant," she said, seeming to speak without conscious thought. "The financial analysis you provided, the strategic recommendations, the way you handled the Henderson negotiations, that required extraordinary expertise and sophistication." "It did," I agreed matter-of-factly. Charles began pacing between the windows and the fireplace, clearly trying to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about our respective identities. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. "When your parents described you when they said you were embarrassing, socially inept, likely to make your other guests uncomfortable," I supplied. "Because they weren't entirely wrong. I am awkward at dinner parties and charity events. I do ask questions that make people uncomfortable. I'm not particularly good at small talk or social performance." Margaret looked up from her chair with an expression of dawning realization. "But that's not the same as being incompetent," she said quietly. "No, it's not. But for most of my life, my family has treated social awkwardness and professional competence as mutually exclusive." I moved to stand near the fireplace, where family photographs dating back several generations created a visual timeline of Caldwell family history. "Your parents have no idea," Charles said, and it wasn't a question. "None whatsoever. They know I do financial consulting, but they assume it's small-scale work that pays adequately, but isn't particularly significant. They've never asked for details about my clients or projects." Margaret stood up suddenly, beginning to pace in a pattern that mirrored her husband's movement. "This is extraordinary," she said, speaking more to herself than to us. "All those months we've been working with this brilliant strategic consultant, praising her insights and depending on her expertise, and she's been sitting right here in our extended family. The irony hasn't been lost on me," I admitted with a slight smile. Charles stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. "You could have told us months ago. You could have revealed the connection and transformed how your family sees you. Why maintain the separation?" The question I had been expecting, and one I had answered for myself many times over the past year. "Because I wanted to know if I could succeed entirely on my own merits," I said simply. "I wanted to build something that had nothing to do with family connections or social performance or fitting into anyone else's expectations of who I should be." Margaret and Charles exchanged a look that suggested they were beginning to understand the full scope of what I had accomplished. "You saved our company," Charles said quietly. Not as Eleanor's sister or as someone with family connections, but as a strategic partner who saw opportunities and solutions that others missed. I did, I confirmed. Margaret walked to the window overlooking the estate's gardens, where snow continued to fall gently on the perfectly maintained grounds. Your parents, she said without turning around, have no idea what they've overlooked, do they? No, I said simply. They don't. Charles cleared his throat, and when I looked at him, his expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching respect, mixed with amazement. Eleanor's wedding reception is probably not the appropriate place for this conversation, he said formally. But I want you to know that discovering this connection doesn't change my assessment of your professional capabilities. If anything, it increases my respect for what you've accomplished. I appreciate that, I replied sincerely. Margaret turned back from the window, her social composure fully restored, but her eyes still bright with the implications of what she had learned. We should return to the reception, she said practically. People will notice if we're gone too long. As we prepared to leave the sitting room, Charles paused with his hand on the door handle. Miss Whitmore, Callie, he said, using my first name for the first time in our business relationship. I hope this revelation can remain private until you decide how you want to handle it with your family. Thank you, I said, genuinely grateful for his discretion. As we walked back toward the ballroom, I felt the weight of months of secrecy lifting from my shoulders. The carefully maintained separation between my two worlds had ended, but not in the dramatic confrontation I had sometimes imagined. Instead, it had happened quietly, with dignity intact and respect preserved on all sides. Eleanor's wedding celebration continued around us as we returned to our respective places. The bride and groom were dancing to their chosen song while guests watched with the kind of sentimental appreciation that made wedding receptions memorable. But everything had changed. Charles and Margaret now knew that the family member they had considered too embarrassing for Christmas dinner was actually the strategic partner who had built their business empire. And I finally knew that my success hadn't required changing who I was. It had simply required finding people who valued what I could actually accomplish. The little sister, who had always been the exception in her own family, had discovered she was exactly who she was supposed to be. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about finding your own path to success, regardless of family expectations or social limitations.